Okay, thank you, Ron. Appreciate the introduction. So, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone wherever you are, and welcome to this PetraSkills Tech Tuesday webinar. This one is entitled Efficient and Safe Operations in Reduced Staffing Situations. It was quite a struggle to come out with the best name for this. But really, I wanted to have something which flagged and discussed the kind of issues that we're facing now in the middle of the COVID-19 situation, and that we can face also in other situations where our ability to fully staff our facilities is impacted for one reason or for another. I recall a few years ago, I was managing a petrochemicals facility in Manchester, UK. And at that time in the UK, we had a blockade of refineries. And that meant that fuel couldn't get from the refineries to all of the depots and from the depots to the filling stations. And it gave us a lot of challenges in terms of how to get people to work because they didn't have fuel for their vehicles, how to get them home, how to make sure we had fuel for backup generators, etc. And we had to manage that situation very closely. So we're in this situation now where we are faced with COVID-19 and all of its consequences. And what I'd like to do today is to share some thoughts, but I'm sure that amongst the people on the call, you have some personal experiences and some best practices. So do please feel free to share those in the chat box. As always, our lawyers tell us that we have to put the legal bit in the presentation, that the information is general, no warranties, etc., no liability. It's something we have to do. It isn't really relevant to what we're going to be discussing today, because I'm not going to say you must do this, but I'm sharing some ideas that you can take away and that you can think about. So Ron covered the participant and the chat boxes. I just note that when you send something on chat, you can change who you send it to. And you have various options from the drop down that's shown on here. So this is me. My name is Andy Gibbons. I'm a consultant and a trainer. I'm based in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, and I've been working in the oil and gas sector for well over 30 years now, for quite some time. When I was working in operational roles, I worked with both Shell and with Nova Chemicals. And those jobs were really around operations. So I initially came in as a process engineer. I then worked as project engineer, shift manager, operations manager, and finally site manager at sites both in the UK and in France. I've also crossed over the line and done some work in upstream, working with Total in Abu Dhabi, and that was supporting them with the development of emergency procedures, emergency response plans, coordination of exercises, drills, etc. So my experience is mostly downstream, but I have worked in upstream as well. I've done a lot of training for many years in oil, gas, and petrochemicals. And my main areas of focus have been around process safety and operational excellence, which really link back to my previous operational background. And I've many years of consultancy experience working for industry clients, working for regulatory bodies, for example, here in Dubai with Dubai Municipality, and all manner of different projects. So we're talking about efficient and safe operations. It can be on shift, it can be across the board, but in these situations like now, where we have the potential for reduced staffing. And if we think about it, it's more than just reduced staffing, because COVID-19 has created a lot of anxiety, it's created a lot of stress, there are concerns about family, there are concerns about our jobs. So it's created a lot of issues that potentially could come into the workplace and could affect us. So the aims from the webinar, the objectives are to understand what are the issues. I want to outline a possible approach for dealing with these issues. And for all of us who are working in high hazard facilities, we will have some form of process safety management program. And what I would like to put forward is a mechanism for building on the process safety management systems, the process safety management frameworks that we have, rather than creating something that is specific and unique to this situation. Because really, if we think about it, if we have a good process safety management system, it should work in all different situations. That's the point of it. It should be there to manage all of our risks. And we'll talk about the strategies that we can develop to avoid the pitfalls that are associated with this situation. So, of course, COVID-19 has dominated the news. It's dominated our lives for the last few months. We've all been under some form of lockdown. We've had restrictions in our lives. We've had limitations in the workplace. We've had social distancing, etc., etc., etc. And frankly, we've all seen so much of this. In these times now where we are looking to get people back into the workplace, there is a WHO guidance note, which is called Getting Your Workplace Ready for COVID-19. And it's a good note. It's a good set of practical guidelines for how to get people back into work, how to prevent the spread of the virus in the workplace, for how to manage any events, meetings that you might have, how to protect as far as possible those employees who travel, and the things that you can do if COVID-19 arrives in your work. So it's very easy to find. If you just Google WHO, getting your workplace ready for COVID-19, or if you follow that particular URL, you can get to that guidance note. But I don't want to replicate what's covered there. I want to talk more about a management approach that we can follow in this situation. So the big question for all of us is what is different in this situation? We know we have COVID-19. We know we might face other situations that might be pandemics, or they might be unrest, or whatever in the future. And we have to think about the issues that are created by this situation. So, COVID-19, it's a hazard. It's a hazard that is coming to our work. And in different ways. It can be the physical effects of the illnesses that are created by the virus, but there is a lot more as well that we have to think about. For sure, it's created a lot of anxiety. We've heard about the stress that people have been under, the fact that they're worried about their own health, they're worried about catching the disease, they're worried about the consequences on their families, they're worried about future income, worried about having a job. So many things that have been created as a result of COVID-19. There are associated with that a lot of extra stress. And if we bring stress into the workplace, and if we're not really focused on the tasks that we're carrying out, then we have more risk of making a mistake, more risk of getting something wrong, and that could potentially lead to an incident or to a near miss. There are also potentials for fatigue, and particularly in organizations where we're handling shift work, this is already a major factor. We should ideally have fatigue risk management systems in place. We should have guidelines in place for preventing fatigue, for spotting the signs of fatigue, and for dealing with fatigue in the workplace. Now suddenly we have a situation where we may have staff absent, but we still need to cover key jobs. We may have staff who can't travel from the workplace and are obliged to work for longer periods. It may be that we just simply can't get people to and from the workplace, and we're having to cover with who we have. So we have to think about fatigue. All of those issues, anxiety, stress, fatigue, they can lead to a lack of focus, a lack of concentration. And when we're dealing with things like shift handover, we're dealing with permit to work, we're analyzing trends on our control systems, we're doing all sorts of logging, we're managing contractors, etc. If we lose focus, then we potentially increase the risk. And of course, related to all of that, we have absenteeism. We don't know from day to day necessarily what will be the numbers of people who are coming into our facilities and what that means in terms of safe and efficient operation. A few weeks ago, I did a webinar on process safety strategies. And just as something of a recap, process safety has been around for a very long time, albeit with the terminology of process safety somewhat more recently. But when the approach really first started, we were using strategies which were based on standards. Standards telling us what to do, how to design our equipment, how to design blast walls, etc., etc. So standards-based strategies telling us what we should do. Then, following on from that, with incidents like the Flixborough explosion in the UK, like the Bhopal gas tragedy in India, like the Piper Alpha platform fire and explosion in the North Sea, these led to significant amounts of legislation. And we had the need to put in place compliance-based strategies, really telling us what we have to do to meet our legal obligations in the countries in which we operate. And that's good. We have things like Seveso 3 directive in Europe, OSHA in the US, we have the EPA regulations, telling us what we have to do, what we have to comply with. And that really improved the performance in terms of process safety. In the 90s, with the advent of total quality, we focused on continuous improvement, saying, yeah, it's all well and good that we comply, but we have to do more. So we have to look at how we improve our performance. And that meant having key performance indicators and having reviews to make sure that we drive improvement. And more recently, there's been a move towards risk-based processing, not throwing away the continuous improvement, but really focused on understanding the risks in our facilities and making sure that all that we do is based around controlling and minimizing those risks. And we have frameworks like the Center for Chemical Process Safety, risk-based process safety management guidelines. There are other frameworks such as the UK Energy Institute Process Safety Framework. And the most effective process safety management systems are based on risk-based strategies. How can I better manage the risk in our facilities? And that leads me to the point at the bottom of this slide, that if it comes to a situation like now, what we shouldn't do is ditch all of the good stuff that we have from our process safety management systems. We should work with what we have. We should adapt to the circumstances, but we shouldn't change direction. So we should be building on all of those good practices we have at the moment. So this is the Center for Chemical Process Safety, the CCPS, Risk-Based Process Safety Management Guidelines. It has a total of 4 pillars, and within those pillars, 20 elements in total for managing process safety in our facilities. The 4 pillars are committing to process safety, understanding the hazards and the risks. Once we have that understanding, managing those risks, and learning from experience. And we think about it intuitively. If we do all of that, if we're truly committed, we understand the risks, we manage those risks, and we learn, then we should be minimizing the risk of incident in our facilities. I think it's a very straightforward, very intuitive approach. So if I take the first pillar, and that is commit to process safety, we need to have leadership in any organization, in any facility that is really committed to effective process safety. Because like anything in life, if we don't have commitment from the organization, from the leadership of the organization, we're not going to achieve success. And I'm sure that a lot of you on the call, you've seen some of the case studies from the likes of the Chemical Safety Board, or you may have seen the case studies from Alpha or from Opal. And almost without fail, in those case studies, a lack of real commitment, a lack of organizational and leadership focus has been a major contributor to those incidents. So, to process safety, it has 4 elements, which are process safety culture, compliance with standards, workforce involvement, and stakeholder outreach. And my view here is that this is right, this is what we should have. But we should be thinking about what more do we need to do at this point in time to deal with the situation that we're facing. So I've put in here some extra bullet points in red that go beyond the basic requirements of those elements to think about the situation. So thinking about process safety culture, the first thing is that the leadership team needs to be there. It needs to be leading the response to the crisis, and that needs to be clearly visible to all people in the organization. Yes, we recognize it, we're doing something about it, we're leading it, we're setting the direction. It's vital in this situation to communicate, and communicate some more. We need to be talking with our teams, with our people, with our contractors all the time, so that they understand this is what we're doing and this is why we're doing it, but also we're hearing, because there are concerns amongst your staff. There are issues that they have. And if we don't hear those concerns, we don't act on those concerns, then we could be missing something which which increases risk. We should always build trust. It's not something which is just required for a crisis situation, but at a time like this, it's absolutely paramount. We need to have trust that people understand the decisions we're making, they understand the actions that we're taking, and they know why we're taking those decisions. Linking back to that people dimension, we need to understand the impacts of COVID-19, or indeed of any situation, on our people. And we also have to recognize that everyone is different. You will have some people in your organizations, oh, no big deal. It's just one of those things, we just got to get on with it. You've got other people who are genuinely scared for all sorts of different reasons. And we have to be ready as an organization to adapt, to do things differently. A good example here might be permit to work. We're all faced with permit to work. We have our permit to work procedures in place. We have expectations amongst the people who are handling the permits in terms of what they should do, when they should physically go and check isolations, etc. And it may be that as a result of COVID-19, we just don't have the staffing levels to be able to commit as much resource to permit to work as normal. And that's okay as long as we do something about it. And that might be communicating to the contractors, people who are being issued permits, to say, look, it's going to take longer because of this, but please don't put pressure on the people who are issuing the permits to work. Or it might be that you say, okay, we've got too much maintenance work and other activity taking place. We need to actively reduce this to be able to cope with the staffing that we have at the moment. So one example then, it could apply to many different areas. Then in terms of compliance with standards, all of a sudden we have something new. We have sets of guidelines which can come from government, they can come from WHO, they can be corporate guidelines in terms of extra cleaning, in terms of social distancing, in terms of changes in the workplace. We need to rapidly assimilate these guidelines, we need to make them happen in our workplaces. Very important, the next element in commit to process safety is workforce involvement. And here, there is a lot of rapid decision making that's taking place. And we should involve the workforce in this decision making, allow people to make inputs, to make comments, to share concerns, and link this to effective communication. And finally, the last element within this pillar is stakeholder outreach. And where there is something that is particularly important, we should be communicating that to our stakeholders. Those stakeholders could be the regulatory authorities, they could be our neighbors, they could be other operators within the complex in which we operate. So we have to think about what more do we need to communicate to people who are affected by what we do. The next pillar of risk-based process safety management is manage risk. And as I said before, COVID-19 is a hazard, and it's a hazard which will create risk within our, but of all different kinds. So the elements within manage risk, operating procedures, they shouldn't really change. We just need to make sure that those procedures still are being followed, they're in active use. But in terms of safe work practices, and I mentioned just now permit to work, how much activity can we manage? Are we properly resourced? Are we doing things properly? Or are we allowing the situation and the reduced staffing situation that we have to make us cut corners, and by cutting corners increase risk? Then we have asset integrity and reliability. Programs like risk-based inspection. But it may be the case that we don't have the resource to be able to carry out all of those planned preventive maintenance interventions. So again, if we can't do something which is scheduled and which has been scheduled based on risk, we need to risk assess. What is the impact of doing that? Is there something additional that we have to do to deal with that? The next element is contractor management. And as always, we're dealing with large amounts of contractors coming into our facility. We have all of a sudden some additional guidelines that have been put in place regarding COVID-19. We, as the operating companies, have the obligation to make sure that we look after the contractors coming into our facilities. We cannot assume they will know what to do, particularly in terms of our guidelines for COVID-19. So we have to build in some additional elements to the induction process. And again, we have to be assessing the workload to see whether that is consistent with things like staff level, with things like the safe work practices that we've talked about, and indeed the social distancing guidelines. If you've got a construction project and you have to have people separated by a certain distance, then can you realistically comply with that with the workforce that you have? Training and performance assurance is an element that shouldn't substantially change. Management of change. This is, I think, probably the biggest part of the approach that we have to take. We have to be constantly on the lookout for changes that need to be reviewed by our MOC process. And these may be wider than we think. So I'll come on to that in more detail. There are things like management of fatigue to consider. Again, I'll talk about that more in the coming slides. And also, if staffing levels change, then we have to stop and think, what is the impact? What do we have to do? How do we manage that? Operational readiness, things like our pre-startup safety reviews. The key there is to make sure that we're still doing that, we're still doing it effectively, we still have the resource to do it. If we don't have the same level of resource, then think about extending that period. Think about doing whatever it takes to do that safely and to do that effectively. In concept of operations, I'll come on more to talk about operational discipline. To me, operational discipline is about doing things the right way every single time. And that is about permit to work, it's about other safe systems of work, it's about shift handover, it's about the level of focus and monitoring that we have on the job to make sure that we're doing things the way we want them to be done. And finally, the last element there, is emergency management. And again, we have to make sure that we have the capability to manage emergencies. So, managing the issues. Enhancing the process safety culture. I've really touched on all of the points in this slide, but we have to have strong and highly visible leadership in this situation. Really leading from the front, being seen, using our business continuity plans to make sure that we're doing what we've said that we will do when we've thought about these situations. And that means communicating very, very often. It means being present. It means being visible. It means creating an atmosphere of trust, allowing people to talk and to share their concerns. We have to be understanding. People are affected by this, as I said before, and we have to spot the signs of this, and we have to be prepared to compensate for changes that people might have in performance. You might see someone doing a job to a lesser standard than they would normally perform that job. They might have sick relatives. There might be issues at home. There might be financial worries because of family members losing jobs. So we have to compensate for change in performance. We have to recognize it, and we have to be very considerate in the way that we do things whilst keeping the focus on doing the job properly. And we have to be very adaptable because situations will change. You might find that from one day to the next, the number of people who are able to come into work is different. We have to be prepared. We have to be thinking about those things. We have to have contingency plans in place so that we can do the right things. What we don't do is hope for the best. We don't just hope that we can get along with things. So, practical actions that we can take in regard to this pillar of commit to process safety. Town hall meetings with our employees, obviously socially distanced. If it's a COVID-19 situation, we can use Zoom, we can use Teams, we can use WebEx, whatever, to do that. We should have very clear briefings to all of the leaders throughout the organization with very clear expectations for what are the additional things that they should be doing to manage in this particular situation. Regular briefing meetings with all of our shift. I've been on shift, and I was working 2 12-hour days, 2 12-hour nights. There were certain sets of shifts, like when you were working days on a weekend, nights on a Monday and a Tuesday, that you wouldn't see members of the leadership team because of the hours. But we have to make more effort in this situation to have regular briefings with all of the shift teams and to make that a two-way process. And that really comes on to the next point there. We have to listen. What are the concerns? What are worrying people? Have they got concerns about the safety of the job? What more can we do to help? It may be that in terms of some of the communication, we can use social media. It might be WhatsApp groups. It might be a Twitter account. Obviously, if you're doing that, you have to be aware that people from the outside will be able to see what you're doing. But it's one means of communicating on a widespread basis. I can't stress enough the importance of management of change, and particularly where that relates to organizational changes. When I teach process safety, I talk a lot about the fire and explosion in Texas City in 2005, and I'm sure that some of you have seen the case study Anatomy of a Disaster produced by the US Chemical Safety Board. Nothing to do with a pandemic situation like COVID-19, but even in those effectively stable conditions, there wasn't enough emphasis on management of change, particularly related to organizational changes. They reduced the panel, the board operator positions by 1. And although they had previously conducted studies looking at the workload, they hadn't really factored those studies into a proper management of change to review whether that change could be done without increasing risk. So in these situations, we should stop and think, are we increasing the level of risk by the situations that are being forced upon us? Are we doing enough? Do we need to change what we do to adapt to this situation? So it could be changes in staffing levels due to absence. If your shift team is supposed to be 8 people and 6 people come in one day, what do you have to do? You may already have guidelines in place for this. Maybe at a certain point you say we have to shut down, we have to stop production because we haven't got enough people to adequately cover emergency response, to adequately deal with the situation. It might be that we look to call other people in that situation. Again, you probably have guidelines for that. We might have to have people who are standing in as managers, as supervisors, as signatories. And that's okay, but again, we have to ask ourselves, are we increasing the level of risk? And do we need to do more to support them in the positions that they are temporarily covering? It might be that we have changes in the ways of working. And again, whatever that might be, we have to assess, does it increase the risk? And if yes, what do we do about it? And it might mean that we need to mothball certain sections of our facility. But again, if we're going to do that, have we got the procedures? Have we got the protocols? Can we do that effectively? So management of change, to me, it becomes an almost daily and dynamic activity for the leadership team that is managing this whole process. We need to use it rigorously, and we need to use it regularly. And it's very beneficial to record what you've reviewed, why, and what decisions have been made. Because if something were to happen, but you can demonstrate very clearly that you've thought about it, that you've considered the risks, that you've taken appropriate actions, then that will be taken into account when it comes to the investigation process. But more importantly than that, if we consider the risks, we're more likely to minimize them by putting the right controls in place. So we ask ourselves on a daily basis, what has changed? Is there anything that we're doing that constitutes a change? Then, does it impact the risk? Have we changed the level of risk as a result of this change? What extra actions, what extra things do we have to do to keep the level of risk acceptable to us? Or if the level of risk cannot be brought to an acceptable level, what do we have to do as a consequence? And we have to keep on monitoring for weak points. And this is where the communication, the visibility, the being out in the facilities talking to people comes in, where we say, what's working well? Where do we have weak points? Where do we need to do more? And by listening to the people that are working in the facilities, we will hear this. And as I say, document your decisions. Make notes of them. Keep minutes of the meetings so that we can see what we've done and why. And it also demonstrates that we truly are managing the changes in this situation. You probably have, I'm sure you all have, in fact, a documented management of change procedure. And it will have something like the steps that are shown in this slide. It's very standard. You go from initiation through to design, to planning, approval, you implement, you check, and you close out. It may be that you have to look at how you adapt your management of change procedure to deal with the extent of dynamic changes that you're having, because things are happening very, very quickly, and you may not, for example, have all of the required signatories present. So you may need to adapt your procedure to be able to deal with that situation. As Ron has mentioned in the chat box, if anyone has any questions or any comments to make, then please put those in the chat box. I'm seeing that there are one or two questions starting to appear, but please feel free to ask anything. Or if you've got a best practice, then please do share that. My next point is about operational discipline. In CCPS, risk-based process safety, it's called conduct of operations, but it's essentially the same thing. To me, it's a very simple definition. It's about doing things the right way every single time. It should be part of life for all of our facilities. But we become complacent over time. We sometimes lose focus. When I first started as a shift manager in a facility back in Manchester, sometimes the shift handover took place in the car park. And the shift handover might have been as much as, steady, no problems. It's not good enough. We have to have things done properly. So things like shift handover should be face-to-face. It should be done in the control room or in the place of work. It should be based on written documentation, and it should be a clear two-way communication process that should take as long as it needs to take. Permit to work. We need to make sure we're doing it properly. Management of change, that we're doing it properly, or we safely adapt our MOC procedure to deal with the situation. We need to be using operating procedures. We need to be doing planned maintenance correctly, or if we can't, to make risk-based decisions. We need to be setting expectations. Now, I think we should do this all of the time, but when it comes to the situation like now, with the increased stress and the potentially decreased staffing, we need to be doing this even more. And we need to be showing that we are understanding. We're asking our teams to show us, to tell us that they understand what we're asking them to give commitment, and to please shout up if anything is not correct. If the procedures are no good, if permits are becoming stressed, then get people to share that feedback. Anxiety and stress can be major factors. And on the table on the right-hand side of this slide are some figures that have come from a SPA-H human reliability survey. And what these figures are saying is that the risk of human error is multiplied if any of these factors are present. Now, I don't really care about the numbers in the right-hand side, because they will be different depending on the extent of that particular issue. But the fact is that if we have these factors in our workplace, then there will be more risk of human error. So things like lack of time, which can come from reduced staffing, things like extreme stress, which may be workplace related or may come from outside. Complex tasks, which might be if you've got someone more inexperienced standing in for a role. Poor training experience can be the same thing. Lack of procedures, high fatigue, poor communication, poor supervision. All of those can increase the risk of human error. And all of these factors can be present in our reduced staffing situation. And that's why we need the eyes and the ears, so that we can be picking up where are the weak points in what we're doing. I mentioned fatigue, and fatigue was a major factor in the incident in Texas. That was a shutdown situation. And the operator who was on the panel on the day that incident occurred worked 30 consecutive 12-hour day shifts. He was extremely fatigued, and that would affect the decision making, that would affect the ability to spot an issue before it occurred. Fatigue is something that Now, if you're under, if you're using API, there is a recommended practice for fatigue risk management systems. For all organizations, you should have some fatigue risk management system, some kind of fatigue. The things that can be affected by fatigue, it can be dizziness, it can be hand-to-eye coordination, it might be blurred vision. The physical symptoms are things like bloating, abdominal pain, constipation, diarrhea, aching muscles, apathy, loss of motivation. It can be loss of appetite. From a work point of view, on the right-hand side here, we have difficulty in concentrating, impaired judgment, indecisiveness, and slower than normal reflexes, all of which could lead to an increase in risk, lead to an increase in the risk of making an error. So we have to be doubly conscious of fatigue and its causes and its consequences in this particular situation. In some courses that I cover, I go into this in more detail, but there are many implications for the shift workers. And we shouldn't be doing anything at this point in time which is adding to the risk. And it might be a good time, excuse me, to give our shift workers some refresher guidance on dealing with fatigue, the importance of effective sleep management, good diet, plenty of exercises, using light to maximize sleep, minimizing the risks that are associated with fatigue, training and education, and it's always a controversial point, but allowing people to take power naps to refresh in the workplace. Training and education, very important that leaders and supervisors are conscious of the effects of stress and they are watching out for them and they have the ability to manage those consequences. For those who haven't seen it, there is an ANSI API recommended practice 755 on fatigue risk management systems. This was put in place based on a recommendation coming from the investigation into Texas City. And this gives the guidance to employees, managers, and supervisors on understanding, recognizing, and managing fatigue in the workplace. It's a good guideline, and if you haven't seen it and you do have shift work in your organization, it's worth taking a look. So, in summary, there are extra risks that will be introduced into the workplace as a result of the staffing implications, the stress implications of COVID-19. We should be using business continuity plans, but really supported by our process safety management systems. They're there, they should be flexible, they should be able to cope with situations such as this. Highly important, though, is the leadership, the culture, the people dimension. Very important to meet regularly. It's probably daily. What's happening? What's changed? What do we need to do? Where do we need to use management of change? We need to communicate very clearly and very, very often. And of course, yes, we want to produce, we want to be efficient, we want to meet all of our targets, but we have to put people first. We do have a number of courses which are related to this, which are shown on this particular slide. But that's all that I would like to cover. I'm sure that a lot of this is known to everyone. It's very, very intuitive, I would hope. But it's easy when we're in the middle of a situation like this to lose some focus. And the more we can get things right in a planned and controlled manner, the less risk we have. So, Ron, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do, Andy, and thank you very much. I found that was really interesting for me. First question from Makta was, what could be the impact of these changes on our financial results? In other words, is it going to cost me?
Yeah, it certainly could. Depending on your arrangements, it could have impacts on costs for overtime, because you may need to get people in on paid overtime to be able to cover absences. And of course, it may mean that in the worst case, you have to shut down all or parts of your facilities, which obviously has a huge financial impact. So yes, it can, but we should never allow that to be a reason for doing something wrong. If the level of risk becomes too much, then we have to stop and think about, well, okay, we have financial consequences, but we can't accept those from a risk point of view.
Yeah, and it just makes me think of the wise man who once said, if you think this is expensive, try having a process failure.
Yeah. You have a fire explosion, it will cost an awful lot more.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Next one is, how would you handle the differences between office staff and on-site staff? I imagine this is, we're talking about office staff being in an air-conditioned environment, but they still suffer from fatigue.
Yeah. Certainly from a fatigue point of view, office staff can suffer from fatigue, but the risks are far greater on shift workers who are working against the body clock and against the circadian rhythms. But first of all, when it comes to things like the COVID-19 guidelines, when it comes to social distancing, then you have to adhere with all of the guidelines in that respect. I think one of the big challenges is in what you would term essential staffing. If you purely have the shift workers working and the leadership is never there and never supporting the kinds of approaches that I've talked about in this presentation, you are potentially increasing the risk. So I think you need to find that right balance of remote working and people coming into the facility, obviously with the right precautions in place. But in all cases, you have to follow the guidelines. If there's something more that's meant by the question, then please put that into the text box.
Okay, we got a couple more. Next one I thought was interesting. Is there technology that can help us in this reduced manning environment?
Well, certainly things from a communication perspective, like talking with shift teams, we can use Zoom, we can use Teams, etc. We've now learned that we can use those quite successfully, even for webinars like this. There can be technologies in terms of monitoring of our facilities and things like shift handover that could be used, that could allow that to be done without as much physical proximity. But obviously, you need to have those in place already to be able to get benefit from them. But I think it's certainly a question that's worth asking in terms of where you are now, what you have, what things can you use like that. If you get for example, a leadership call with a shift team for half an hour once every set of shifts, that can be highly beneficial, and it doesn't necessarily need a face-to-face meeting.
Good point. The last question I've got there, and I'm sure this is what every supervisor has got at the back of his mind. What can I do if someone refuses to change their working practices?
Yeah, it's a good one. We've all seen the videos of people in the supermarket being asked to wear a mask and going ballistic when they're thrown out of the store. But ultimately, you've got a duty of care. You've got a duty of care to all of the staff in your facility. And what I would personally do in that situation would be to have a quiet word with that person in the first instance, to say, look, John, we have these guidelines, we're obliged to follow them, so I'm asking you now, please do it. If that person still refuses, then you're getting into a disciplinary situation where you have a procedure in place and you're left with no choice but to invoke that procedure because they're putting other people at risk. But if you can deal with it personally, take them around the back of the pallet, sort them out.
That's why we have the legal bit, isn't it?
I'm not advocating violence anyone. That was a joke.
Well, certainly enough, that was the last of our questions for now. So thank you very much, Andy. If anyone does have another question, please drop it in the chat window right now.
I see a couple to me, Ron, in the chat window.
Okay.
If I got out of resources for a high-risk equipment maintenance, do I need to go to stop the job or contact with the manufacturer for considering a PM delay? Yeah, if you don't have the resources, then clearly that is an issue. And if you're going to delay the PM, then it should be on a risk-based approach. So by all means, contacting the manufacturer and looking for what latitude you can be given is a good approach in that situation. Do you prefer to perform risk assessment for every PM? I would say it depends on the criticality. In some cases, you would want to perform the assessment. In other cases, it might be that it can wait and you can make that decision. But you need to document your decisions.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Okay, Andy, I don't see any more questions coming in. And so I think we're just about done. Right, okay. Almost on the hour.
Thanks, everybody. And I wish everyone luck in this situation. I hope we're through it soon and we get back to normal as quickly as possible. So thank you very much for participating.
Oh, before you do go, I just had a message from Mokhtar. We experienced the lockdown, but we don't feel more change on our operations. I work in a shipping company. Interesting comment.
Yeah, and clearly in a marine environment, and Ron is the expert on that. People are living closely together, and we've seen with some of the cruises lately what the potential spread can be. So I think, again, you have to be making decisions based on risk, and that's why, as I said, look at every situation and assess, does it increase your risk? And if so, what action do you need to take?
Yeah, I must admit, I've got some colleagues of mine who are still in the marine environment, and a lot of people are actually having a lot of difficulty getting home after a spell on a ship. And some people who were expecting to do 4 months are ending up doing 8 months or 10 months.
Yeah.
And it's just because of the travel limitations. And it makes life very difficult. Okay, then, everyone. Well, thank you very much again. And don't forget to dial in next week. Next week, we have a subsurface webinar. And next week, we'll be talking about cement squeeze, which is rather an interesting concept. So those of you who are into drilling wells and you'd want to do a cement job, I think you'd find it a lot of interest. And please pass this along to your friends and colleagues. Let them know. And don't forget, this is free. We welcome comments, any suggestions, and thank you for your attendance. This webinar is being recorded, and by this time tomorrow, if you go onto the website, you will be able to access the recording. So if your colleagues could not attend this, then please let them know that the recording will be available. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.